I grew up in the Bronx, the South Bronx. The Bronx is my heart and my soul. It made me who I am. But like with many inner cities, people forget that the Bronx is a place with history, love, and most importantly, people. Beautiful people with amazing life stories. I was blessed to be born in the South Bronx. You see, for me, growing up in the South Bronx, it was my entire world. I had never, ever been anywhere else in my entire life. Now, hold on. I don't want to paint an image of myself as this young, dumb, and ignorant little boy either, right? See, I was a really smart kid. I was the smartest kid in my neighborhood. I was even smart enough to know about some far, some distant, and yes, some even exotic places such as Connecticut, Staten Island, and my personal favorite, New Jersey. Yo, you talk about some exotic language, culture, and dress to a boy from the South Bronx, New York, New Jersey. And my mother would make it seem even more exotic because she had a thick Latina accent. And she'd be like, Papi, one day we're going to get in the car and we're going to visit all your cousins in Nueva Jersey, right? And my sister would go running through the house looking for her passport because Nueva Jersey sounded like this exotic location. Okay, so maybe I was a little young and ignorant, but I wasn't dumb. You see, for me, life in the South Bronx, that was my universe. For me, life in the South Bronx, that was my world, and I think that happens for all of us. Wherever we grow up, that becomes our norm. That becomes what we know. And I grew up thinking that one-bedroom apartments were supposed to house 8 people at least, because in my one-bedroom apartment, there were always 8 people at least. I grew up thinking that cars, automobiles were supposed to be multicolored, and you know why? It's because my father had a white station wagon with a blue hood, red doors, and an off-white bumper. It was the most rainbow-licious car you have ever seen in your entire life. Now, I was an observing kid, right? So I'd ask my father, I'd be like, Papi, why is our car so multicolored? And he'd be like, Hijo, doesn't it make sense? This car represents our Puerto Rican roots. You got the red, you got the white, you got the blue. It looks just like the Puerto Rican flag when it drives down the street. It's like its own little Puerto Rican Day parade. And I'd be like, but Papi, we're not Puerto Rican. And he'd be like, that's not the point, right? I also grew up thinking that restaurants like IHOP, Red Lobster, and the Olive Garden were like these really, really fancy restaurants that you reserved only for special occasions like graduations, birthday parties, and baptisms, because on my parents' salaries, those were really, really fancy restaurants. It's all relative. And this was my world, and I was never, ever ashamed or embarrassed of any of it. Our cramped basement apartment, our limited resources, my parents' jobs or salaries, until I transferred into a private school during my junior year of high school. I transferred into a school where the tuition easily surpassed my parents' salaries, and my father took me to school on that first day. And I remember knowing immediately that this was going to be very different. You see, the school was located on the hill in one of the wealthiest neighborhoods in the Bronx. And my father's old and colorful car would struggle to get up that hill. And all the frustrated cars behind us would decide to pass us. Mercedes, Benz, BMW, Lexus, many of them driven by students. And I remember my father looking out the window of his car in awe and looking at me and saying, those are some beautiful cars. It would be nice to own one of them, huh? My father, a grown man who had worked his entire life and was never, ever able to afford a new car. He dropped me off at the front of school that day. He wished me luck. I think he knew that I would need it. And my school day began with classes and introductions and discussions about how people spent their summer. And some people talked about exotic vacations. Some people talked about exotic travel. Some people talked about experiences at summer homes. And this blew my mind. The fact that people had summer homes blew my mind. I mean, don't get me wrong, we also had a summer home. It just happens to be our winter home, our fall home, our spring home. What my mother liked to call an all-seasons type of home, right? By that morning, I felt completely out of place. And I decided that I didn't have to share any of my story. I didn't have to tell anyone about me. Who wanted to hear about my summer sharing a bunk bed with my brother in the hallway of a basement apartment? We didn't even have a room. Who wanted to hear about me waking up every single morning to take care of a laundromat and serve as the janitor of the building that we grew up in just to make my family be able to survive financially? There was nothing interesting, exotic, or fascinating about that. And I decided I wasn't going to lie about who I was. I just wasn't going to share. And somehow that made me feel better. I silenced myself. And at the end of that day, I took the bus ride and my hour-long commute back to the other end of the Bronx, and my mind raced, and I wondered if I belonged at that school. And I finally arrived at my neighborhood. I stepped off the bus, my shoulders finally relaxed, and I saw that outside of my apartment building was my father's car, and he was asleep inside. And this would happen often. You see, my father worked 6 to 7 days a week. Sometimes he'd be so exhausted after work, he would get in his car, drive home, park the car, and sometimes fall asleep behind the wheel with the engine running. And that night, the image of my father sleeping in his car stayed in my mind. Who was I to be embarrassed of anything my parents worked so hard for? My father, who at a very early age dropped out of school in order to work, in order to help his family make ends meet. He ended up becoming a tailor and spent the majority of his life hunched over a sewing machine in a South Bronx dry cleaner. My mother, who earned a business degree from a country and came to this country in search of professional opportunities. Ironically, she would end up working as a kitchen assistant in the dining room of one of the wealthiest firms in New York City. Not exactly the business job she had in mind. Who was I to be embarrassed? I let my father sleep in the car that night a little bit longer. It was quieter than our apartment, trust me. I went inside. My mother had just arrived from work. She was starting dinner. She asked me about school, and I lied and said it was amazing and that I loved it. And she said to me, one day that education will get you out of this basement, son. One day that education will get you out of this basement. I remember thinking that maybe I wasn't in such a rush to leave that basement. That apartment was my home. It was the place that I felt the most comfortable and authentic. It was the place that housed the people, the food, the language, the culture that I loved. It was the walls that held all of the memories of my family, both the good and the bad, that years down the road I would hold on to as my mother lay in a hospital bed dying from 2 bottles of cancer. Memorial Sloan Kettering. My mother, who in that basement apartment instilled in me a passion for education. I would end up burying all my academic awards in her coffin, for I knew that any of my achievements were a direct result of her hard work and faith. That was my home. And it was me. And to this day, memories of that apartment constantly remind me that too many times we ask our youth to shed their identities in exchange for educational opportunities. We ask them to leave their home lives at the doors of our institutions as if there were book bags that they could easily slip off, put in a corner, and gather at the end of the day. See, I think education should help you build on your identity, not require you to shed it in exchange for social mobility. And educators need to understand, support, and affirm the experiences of all of our students. Because we cannot claim to know our kids if we don't know who they are when they leave our campuses. Because at the end of it all, to this day, I am still that boy from the South Bronx basement apartment, and proud of it.